The first tear gas canister exploded 15 feet from Maria Gonzalez's wheelchair, sending acrid white smoke billowing across Constitution Avenue like a toxic fog of war. She threw her hands up instinctively, her protest sign reading, "Access for All," fluttering to the asphalt as soldiers in full riot gear charged toward the crowd of disabled activists, their boots thundering against the pavement in perfect, terrifying synchronization. "Get down! Get down now!" The amplified voice crackled through megaphones as chaos erupted around wheelchairs, mobility scooters, and walking frames. Maria watched in horror as her friend James, a veteran who'd lost both legs in Afghanistan, was yanked from his chair by two guardsmen who apparently couldn't distinguish between a peaceful protester and a terrorist threat. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not today. Not to them. 3 hours earlier. The morning had dawned crisp and hopeful in Washington, D.C. with golden October sunlight streaming through the Capitol's towering oak trees. The Disability Rights Coalition had spent months organizing this march, coordinating with city officials, obtaining permits, arranging accessible transportation for hundreds of activists from across the nation. Their mission was simple, yet profound, to demand passage of the Americans with Disabilities Enhancement Act, legislation that would expand workplace accommodations, improve public transportation accessibility, and increase funding for assistive technologies. Maria had arrived at the staging area, near the Lincoln Memorial at 7 a.m., her custom racing wheelchair gleaming in the early light. As the coalition's communications director, she'd been fielding media calls since 5:30, explaining to reporters why this march mattered, why disabled Americans still faced barriers to full participation in society 29 years after the original ADA became law. This isn't about pity or charity, she'd told CNN's morning correspondent, her voice steady and passionate. This is about equal access to the American dream. We're taxpayers, voters, contributors to our communities. We deserve the same opportunities as everyone else. The crowd had been remarkable in its diversity and dignity. Parents pushed children with cerebral palsy in specialized strollers, decorated with rainbow streamers. Blind veterans walked with their service dogs wearing tiny American flag bandanas. Deaf activists signed enthusiastically to each other while holding colorful banners demanding communication access. Now a group of little people carried a banner reading, "Equal heights, equal rights," with infectious humor and determination. Dr. Patricia Williams, the coalition's founder, had addressed the gathering from a makeshift stage, her powerful voice carrying across the assembled crowd of nearly 2,000 people. At 73, she moved with the careful precision of someone managing multiple sclerosis, but her words carried the fire of 4 decades fighting for disability rights. "Today, we march not as victims, but as victors," she declared, her silver hair catching the morning light. "We march for every child who deserves an accessible classroom, every worker who needs accommodation, every family struggling with caregiving costs. We march because democracy only works when everyone can participate." The cheers had been thunderous, a beautiful cacophony of voices, hands clapping, wheels rolling, and walking sticks tapping against the ground in solidarity. Maria felt that familiar surge of pride and purpose that came with collective action, the electricity of people uniting for justice. By 9:30, the march had begun its careful procession down Constitution Avenue toward the Capitol building. The pace was deliberately slow to accommodate everyone's needs, with medical volunteers walking alongside and water stations positioned every few blocks. Police officers on motorcycles provided escort, their presence friendly and protective rather than intimidating. That's when they encountered Karen Whitmore. She emerged from her BMW X5 like a force of nature, all perfectly blown-out blonde hair and designer workout clothes. Her face contorted with the particular brand of outrage that comes from minor inconvenience, escalating into moral indignation. The march had temporarily blocked her route to her weekly tennis lesson at the exclusive Potomac Country Club, and she was not having it. "This is ridiculous," she shouted at Officer Martinez, who was directing traffic around the marchers. "I have places to be. You can't just shut down the entire city for this circus." Officer Martinez, a 20-year veteran of the Metropolitan Police, maintained his professional composure despite the woman's increasingly aggressive tone. He'd seen entitled residents lose their minds over much smaller disruptions. But something about this woman's demeanor put him on edge. "Ma'am, this is a permitted demonstration," he explained patiently. "The street will reopen in about 40 minutes. I can direct you to an alternate route if you're in a hurry." "Alternate route?" Karen's voice rose to a shriek that could have shattered glass. "I've been driving this route for 15 years. These people have no right to block traffic with their wheeled contraptions and attention-seeking nonsense." The marchers near the front of the parade heard her tirade and began to murmur among themselves. Maria wheeled closer, concerned about the escalating situation. She'd dealt with hostile encounters before during protests, but there was something uniquely venomous about this woman's anger. "Excuse me," Maria said calmly, approaching Karen with the diplomatic skills she'd honed through years of advocacy work. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience. We know street closures are frustrating, but we have all the proper permits. This should only take another half hour or so." Karen turned on Maria with the fury of someone who viewed any attempt at reasonable discourse as a personal attack. Her eyes narrowed as she took in Maria's wheelchair, her coalition t-shirt, her olive skin and Spanish accent. "Don't you dare patronize me," Karen snapped. "I know exactly what this is about. You people always want special treatment, always demanding handouts and accommodations. And now you're bringing your whole gang here to intimidate decent Americans." The casual cruelty of the words hit Maria like a physical blow, but she maintained her composure. She'd heard worse over the years, learned to respond to ignorance with education rather than anger. "Ma'am, we're just exercising our constitutional right to peaceful assembly," Maria replied evenly. "We're advocating for legislation that would help disabled Americans participate more fully in society. That benefits everyone." But Karen was beyond reason now. Her face flushed red with indignation. She pulled out her iPhone with the aggressive precision of someone preparing for battle, and Maria felt a chill of apprehension. She'd seen that look before, the expression of someone about to escalate a situation far beyond its actual scope. "We'll see about that," Karen muttered, stepping away from the group as she dialed 911. What happened next would later be dissected in congressional hearings, investigated by federal authorities, and studied in journalism schools as a case study in how misinformation can weaponize emergency services. Karen Whitmore, in her fury over a minor traffic delay, made a decision that would forever change the lives of everyone present that day. "Yes, I need to report a terrorist threat," she said into her phone, her voice taking on a breathless urgency that would sound convincing to anyone who hadn't witnessed the preceding conversation. "There are hundreds of armed black militants marching toward the Capitol building. They're in military formation, carrying weapons, shouting anti-American slogans. This looks like an organized attack." The 911 dispatcher, trained to take all potential threats seriously in an era of heightened security concerns, began asking standard questions. But Karen was ready with answers that painted a picture of imminent violence that bore no resemblance to the peaceful disability rights march unfolding 50 feet away. "They have rifles, handguns, maybe explosives in those bags," Karen continued, her voice rising with fabricated panic. "I'm scared for my life." "They're talking about bringing down the government, storming the Capitol. You need to send SWAT teams, the National Guard, everyone." This is another January 6th, but worse. Officer Martinez caught fragments of Karen's conversation and immediately moved closer, his training kicking in. He could see the actual march people in wheelchairs holding signs, families with disabled children, elderly activists moving slowly but determinedly toward their destination. Nothing remotely resembling the scenario Karen was describing to emergency services. "Ma'am, you need to hang up that call right now," he said firmly, reaching for Karen's phone. "That's a false report, and filing a false emergency report is a felony." But Karen danced away from him, completing her call before he could intervene. The damage was done. Somewhere in the labyrinthine emergency response system of the nation's capital, alarms were beginning to sound. Threat assessments were being elevated. Resources were being mobilized based on the word of a woman whose greatest crisis was missing her tennis lesson. Within 20 minutes, the first signs of escalation became visible. Black SUVs with tinted windows began appearing at intersections around the march route. Helicopters materialized overhead, their rotors creating a thunderous backdrop that drowned out the cheerful chants of the disability rights activists. Maria felt her stomach drop as she recognized the signs of a massive security response building around their peaceful demonstration. "Something's wrong," she radioed to Dr. Williams, who was walking near the middle of the march. "We're seeing way too much law enforcement activity. This feels like they think we're some kind of threat." "That's impossible," Dr. Williams replied. But Maria could hear uncertainty creeping into her voice. "We have all our permits. We've been in constant communication with Capitol Police. There must be some unrelated security situation happening nearby." But as they rounded the corner onto 3rd Street, the scope of what was unfolding became unmistakably clear. National Guard trucks were positioning themselves in formation across their path. Soldiers in full combat gear dismounting with the practiced efficiency of a military operation. Snipers were visible on rooftops. Armored vehicles blocked every side street. The marchers began to slow, confusion and fear rippling through the crowd like a wave. Parents pulled their children closer. Veterans in wheelchairs straightened with the muscle memory of old conflicts. The elderly activists looked around with growing alarm, recognizing the signs of impending confrontation, even if they couldn't understand why it was happening. "Attention, this is an unlawful assembly." The voice boomed from military loudspeakers, amplified to painful volumes that made several disabled marchers clutch their ears in distress. "Disperse immediately or face arrest under federal anti-terrorism statutes." Dr. Williams immediately began trying to reach their legal liaison, her fingers shaking as she dialed. Maria started documenting everything with her phone camera, her journalist instincts kicking in even as her heart pounded with fear. Around them, the march was dissolving into chaos as people tried to understand what was happening and how their peaceful demonstration had suddenly become a federal incident. "This is Dr. Patricia Williams from the Disability Rights Coalition." Dr. Williams called out as loudly as her aging voice would allow. "We have full permits for this demonstration. We're peaceful, American citizens exercising our constitutional rights." But her words were lost in the mechanical roar of military vehicles and the increasingly urgent commands from federal forces who had been told they were facing armed terrorists, not disabled Americans seeking equal rights. The cognitive dissonance between what they'd been told to expect and what they actually saw people in wheelchairs holding signs about accessibility should have given someone pause, should have prompted questions, should have prevented what happened next. It didn't. The first tear gas canister landed near a group of children with autism, whose sensory processing disorders made the chemical assault exponentially more traumatic than it would have been for neurotypical individuals. Their screams cut through the chaos like knives, high-pitched sounds of terror and pain that would haunt Maria's dreams for months afterward. More canisters followed in rapid succession, creating a wall of chemical fog that sent the crowd into full panic. People who relied on wheelchairs and mobility devices found themselves trapped, unable to flee quickly enough to escape the advancing line of soldiers who had been told they were subduing dangerous terrorists. Maria watched James Wilson, the Afghanistan veteran she'd known for 3 years, get tackled by 2 guardsmen who apparently couldn't process that a man without legs posed no physical threat to anyone. His prosthetics were knocked loose in the struggle, and he lay on the asphalt, shouting his military service record at soldiers who had been conditioned to see enemies instead of fellow Americans. "I served 3 tours. I lost my legs for this country." James's voice cracked with anguish and disbelief. "How can you do this to us? We're Americans. We're Americans." The scene was beyond surreal. It was obscene. Elderly people in wheelchairs were being zip-tied and loaded into military transport vehicles. A woman with cerebral palsy, who communicated through a tablet device, was being arrested for failure to comply with lawful orders because she couldn't physically respond quickly enough to shouted commands. Children with Down syndrome were separated from their terrified parents, as if they posed some sort of security threat to the United States government. Through it all, news cameras had begun arriving, drawn by the unusual sight of military vehicles surrounding the capital area. What they captured would within hours become some of the most damning footage in the history of American civil rights violations. The contrast was stark and undeniable. Peaceful disabled Americans being brutalized by federal forces based on intelligence that was not just wrong, but deliberately falsified. Maria managed to avoid arrest by quickly wheeling behind a news van, where she found herself face to face with Rebecca Chen, a reporter from the Washington Post, who was live-streaming the entire incident on multiple social media platforms. "Can you tell me what's happening here?" Rebecca asked, her voice steady despite the chaos surrounding them. "The military is saying they responded to reports of armed terrorists, but all I see are disability rights activists with signs and balloons." "That's exactly what this is," Maria replied, tears streaming down her face from both tear gas exposure and sheer emotional devastation. "We're here advocating for the Americans with Disabilities Enhancement Act. We have permits. We've been planning this for months. We notified everyone. I don't understand how this happened. There was this woman earlier. She was angry about traffic. She made some kind of phone call." As Maria spoke, Rebecca's camera captured the ongoing arrests in the background. The footage would soon go viral across every social media platform, generating millions of views and sparking immediate outrage. Disability rights attack began trending within the hour, accompanied by video after video showing federal forces using unnecessary force against people whose only crime was advocating for equal access to American society. But the most damning evidence was yet to emerge. Several marchers had been recording their own footage throughout the morning, documenting what was supposed to be a historic moment in disability rights advocacy. When their phones were finally returned after processing, the videos they contained would provide incontrovertible proof that every word of Karen Whitmore's 911 call had been a lie. The videos showed exactly what had actually happened: a peaceful parade of Americans with disabilities carrying signs that read, "Equal access now," and "Inclusion for all." No weapons of any kind were visible, except for the walking sticks and mobility aids that some participants needed to navigate their environment. No anti-American slogans were being chanted instead. The crowd was singing, "This land is your land," and reciting the Pledge of Allegiance at various points along the route. Most significantly, the videos captured Karen Whitmore's entire interaction with Officer Martinez and her subsequent 911 call. Every word of her false report was clearly audible, along with the officer's attempts to stop her from filing what he correctly identified as a false emergency report. The footage also revealed something else. The demographics of the march bore no resemblance to Karen's description of armed black militants. The crowd was beautifully diverse, including people of all races, ages, and backgrounds, united by their shared experience of disability and their commitment to civil rights. The largest single demographic group was actually white veterans, many of whom had been injured in service to their country and were now advocating for better support systems for disabled Americans. As the videos spread across social media and news networks, the story began to shift from terrorist threat neutralized to peaceful protesters brutalized by federal forces. The National Guard found itself in the impossible position of defending actions taken based on intelligence that was not just faulty, but criminally fabricated. By evening, General Patricia Hayes, the commanding officer who had authorized the response, was facing questions from Pentagon officials who were trying to understand how a routine disability rights march had been miscategorized as a terrorist threat requiring military intervention. "Sir, we responded to credible intelligence indicating an imminent threat to the Capitol," General Hayes explained during an emergency briefing. Multiple sources reported armed militants in military formation approaching federal buildings. The 911 call specifically mentioned weapons and anti-government rhetoric. "General," came the reply from Secretary of Defense Morrison, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "I'm looking at footage of your soldiers tear-gassing people in wheelchairs. Can you explain to me how that constitutes an appropriate response to any threat assessment?" The question hung in the air like an accusation, because there was no good answer. The gap between the reported threat and the actual reality was so vast that it suggested either catastrophic intelligence failure or deliberate deception. As investigators began tracing the source of the initial reports, Karen Whitmore's name began appearing in official documents with increasing frequency. Meanwhile, the medical consequences of the assault were becoming clear. Dozens of marchers had been hospitalized, many suffering from complications related to their underlying disabilities. The tear gas had triggered severe respiratory distress in several people with compromised lung function. The physical trauma of being forcibly removed from wheelchairs and mobility devices had caused injuries that would take months to heal. But perhaps more devastating was the psychological impact. Many of the protesters were veterans who had already endured trauma in service to their country, only to find themselves under attack by their own government for exercising their constitutional rights. The children and young adults with developmental disabilities struggled to understand why the soldiers had hurt them when they were just holding signs asking for better wheelchair access to buildings. Dr. Williams, who had managed to avoid arrest by being near the back of the march when the assault began, spent the evening visiting injured protesters in Walter Reed Medical Center. At 73, with her own health challenges, she moved slowly through the halls, offering comfort and documenting injuries for the legal proceedings that everyone knew were inevitable. "I've been fighting for disability rights for 40 years, she told Maria as they sat in the hospital waiting room. "I've seen ignorance, discrimination, even violence. But I never thought I'd see the day when our own military would attack American citizens for asking for equal treatment under the law." The next morning brought a media firestorm, unlike anything Washington had seen in years. Every major news network led with the story, accompanied by the devastating footage of federal forces attacking peaceful, disabled protesters. International media picked up the story, with headlines like, "America attacks its own disabled citizens," appearing in newspapers across Europe and Asia. Social media exploded with outrage from disability rights advocates, veterans organizations, civil liberties groups, and ordinary Americans who were horrified by what they were seeing. The hashtag, Justice for Disability Rights, began trending globally, accompanied by personal stories from disabled Americans sharing their own experiences with discrimination and violence. Most significantly, several members of Congress began demanding immediate investigations into how such a catastrophic failure of intelligence and judgment could have occurred. Representative Sarah Thompson, herself a wheelchair user who had been paralyzed in a car accident, called for emergency hearings and federal accountability. What happened yesterday was not just an attack on disabled Americans, she declared during an impromptu press conference on the Capitol steps. It was an attack on the fundamental principle that all Americans have the right to petition their government for redress of grievances. If we can't safely advocate for our rights without being tear-gassed by federal forces, then our democracy is in serious trouble. As investigators dug deeper into the source of the false intelligence, Karen Whitmore's role became impossible to ignore. Her 911 call had been recorded, as all emergency calls are, and when played alongside the video footage from the march, the discrepancies were beyond damning. She had described a scene that bore no resemblance to reality, using language clearly calculated to trigger a maximum security response. FBI agents arrived at Karen's suburban home 3 days after the incident, armed with search warrants and a long list of questions about her motivations for filing what federal prosecutors were already calling one of the most consequential false emergency reports in American history. Karen's attempts to justify her actions only made her situation worse. In her first interview with federal investigators, she doubled down on her claims, insisting that she had genuinely believed the marchers posed a threat to public safety. They were blocking traffic illegally, she told Agent Rodriguez, apparently unaware that her every word was being recorded for potential use in federal court. And there were so many of them, moving in formation, carrying bags and equipment. How was I supposed to know they weren't terrorists in this day and age? You can't be too careful. Mrs. Whitmore, Agent Rodriguez replied patiently. We have video footage showing you were told multiple times that this was a permitted disability rights demonstration. We have recordings of your 911 call, where you specifically described armed militants that we now know didn't exist. Can you explain why you reported seeing weapons when none were present? The question hung in the air as Karen realized, perhaps for the first time, the magnitude of what she had done. Her casual lie, born of nothing more than anger over traffic delays, had resulted in a federal military response that injured dozens of innocent Americans and created an international incident. The scope of the consequences was beginning to dawn on her, and with it, the reality that she was likely facing serious federal charges. Meanwhile, the political ramifications were reverberating through Congress with unprecedented speed. The Americans with Disabilities Enhancement Act, which had been stalled in committee for months, suddenly found itself with bipartisan support as lawmakers scrambled to respond to the public outcry over the treatment of disabled protesters. Senator Michael Hayes, the Republican chairman of the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, had opposed the legislation as recently as the week before the march. But the images of disabled Americans being brutalized by federal forces had changed his perspective dramatically. What I witnessed on those news reports was fundamentally un-American, he announced during an emergency committee session that was being broadcast live on C-SPAN. These brave Americans came to our nation's capital to advocate for basic civil rights, and they were met with violence based on lies. We owe them not just an apology, but action. The committee voted unanimously to advance the legislation to a full Senate vote, something that would have been unthinkable just days earlier. The House of Representatives, not to be outdone in their response to the crisis, scheduled their own emergency session to consider companion legislation. But it was the live coverage of these congressional proceedings that provided the climactic moment the disability rights movement had been seeking for decades. As senators debated the merits of expanded accessibility requirements, C-SPAN cameras captured Representative Thompson rising from her wheelchair to address the chamber. Mr. Speaker, I rise not just as a member of Congress, but as someone who uses a wheelchair every day, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed chamber. I rise for every American who has ever been told that our needs don't matter, that accommodating us is too expensive, that we're asking for too much when we simply want the same opportunities as everyone else. Her speech, which would later be hailed as one of the most powerful congressional addresses in decades, laid out in stark terms the daily reality of life with a disability in America. She spoke of inaccessible buildings that excluded disabled people from participating in civic life. She described employment discrimination that kept qualified workers on the sidelines. She outlined the financial hardships that families faced when caring for disabled relatives without adequate support systems. But most of all, she continued, her voice rising with passion, I rise for those brave Americans who came here seeking nothing more than equality under the law, and were met with tear gas and military force. They deserved better from their government. They deserved better from their fellow citizens, and we must ensure that what happened to them never happens again. The speech was interrupted 17 times by standing ovations, an unprecedented show of unity in a chamber usually divided along partisan lines. When she finished, the gallery erupted in applause that lasted nearly 5 minutes, with many spectators, including several disabled Americans who had traveled to Washington to witness the proceedings, wiping away tears. The legislation passed both chambers of Congress within the week, with only 3 dissenting votes in the entire legislature. President Martinez signed it into law in a ceremony held on the exact spot where the disability rights marchers had been attacked, surrounded by many of the same activists who had been tear-gassed days earlier. Today, we turn a moment of national shame into a moment of national progress. The president declared as he put pen to paper, "The Americans with Disabilities Enhancement Act represents our commitment to ensuring that all Americans can participate fully in the promise of our democracy." But the legal consequences for Karen Whitmore were just beginning. Federal prosecutors charged her with multiple felonies, including filing false emergency reports, conspiracy to interfere with civil rights, and making false statements to federal investigators. The case became a landmark prosecution, establishing important precedents about the criminal liability of people who weaponize emergency services against innocent Americans. During her trial, which was covered extensively by national media, the full scope of Karen's deception became clear. Prosecutors played the recording of her 911 call alongside footage from the march, creating a side-by-side comparison that made her lies impossible to deny. Expert witnesses testified about the psychological and physical trauma experienced by the protesters, while disabled Americans filled the courtroom gallery day after day, bearing witness to a trial that many saw as a defining moment for civil rights. Karen's defense attorney argued that she had acted out of genuine fear and confusion, but the jury wasn't buying it. The deliberate nature of her lies, combined with her refusal to recant, even when confronted with evidence of her deception, painted a picture of someone who had callously endangered innocent people to satisfy her own anger and prejudices. The verdict was unanimous on all counts. Karen Whitmore was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison, along with restitution payments to the injured protesters and community service requirements that would extend well beyond her incarceration. The judge's sentencing statement was particularly pointed in its condemnation of her actions. Mrs. Whitmore, your lies didn't just inconvenience traffic or waste emergency resources. Judge Patricia Hernandez declared from the bench, your falsehoods led to a military assault on American citizens exercising their constitutional rights. The physical and psychological trauma you caused will echo through dozens of lives for years to come. This sentence reflects not just punishment for your crimes, but our society's commitment to protecting the vulnerable from those who would exploit emergency systems for personal vendetta. The National Guard officers involved in the response faced their own consequences, though theirs were more complicated, given that they had been acting on what they believed to be credible intelligence. Several officers received formal reprimands for excessive force, while new protocols were implemented to prevent similar incidents in the future. General Hayes took early retirement. Her military career ended by her role in authorizing force against peaceful Americans. But perhaps the most meaningful consequences were the positive changes that emerged from the tragedy. The Americans with Disabilities Enhancement Act funded hundreds of millions of dollars in accessibility improvements, from wheelchair-accessible public transportation to assistive technology programs for disabled workers. University programs in disability studies received federal funding boosts, while civil rights enforcement at the federal level was significantly strengthened. Maria Gonzalez found herself at the center of a movement that had gained unprecedented momentum from the injustice of that October morning. She testified before Congress, spoke at rallies across the country, and worked with legal advocates to ensure that the injured protesters received compensation for their trauma. The coalition's membership tripled in the months following the attack, as Americans with disabilities and their allies rallied together with renewed determination. 1 year later, Maria returned to Constitution Avenue for the first annual Disability Rights Remembrance March. Thousands of Americans gathered in the same spot where tear gas had once filled the air. This time under federal protection and with the full support of government officials who had learned harsh lessons about the consequences of ignoring civil rights. Dr. Williams, now 74 and slowed by her multiple sclerosis, but still fierce in her advocacy, addressed the crowd from the same makeshift stage where she had spoken the year before. But this time, her words carried the weight of victory alongside the memory of trauma. "We gather here not in anger, but in triumph," she declared, her voice carrying across a crowd that included many of the same people who had been tear-gassed the previous year. "We gather to remember that democracy is fragile, that rights must be defended, and that sometimes our greatest victories come from our most painful defeats." The crowd included several surprise guests. James Wilson, the veteran who had been tackled and arrested during the attack, had flown in from his home in Colorado with his wife and 2 young children. He now served on the federal advisory board established by the new disability rights legislation, helping to ensure that the government would never again mistake peaceful Americans for terrorist threats. "I lost my legs fighting for this country overseas," he told the gathered crowd during the commemoration ceremony. "But I found my voice fighting for this country right here at home. What happened to us was wrong, but what we've accomplished together proves that America can still live up to its highest ideals." As the ceremony concluded, Maria wheeled through the crowd, greeting old friends and meeting new allies who had joined the movement in the wake of the attack. She paused at the spot where the first tear gas canister had exploded, now marked with a small memorial plaque, honoring the courage of the protesters who had faced federal violence while seeking nothing more than equal rights. The plaque read simply, "In memory of injustice overcome and democracy renewed." October 15th, when Americans with disabilities stood up for America itself, standing there in the golden October sunlight, surrounded by a community that had grown stronger through shared trauma and collective action. Maria felt the complex emotions that come with hard-won victory. The pain of that terrible day would never fully fade, but it had been transformed into something larger and more powerful than the hatred that had caused it. Karen Whitmore's lies had been intended to silence and disperse a movement for civil rights. Instead, they had amplified that movement beyond anything its organizers had dared to hope for. Her attempt to weaponize emergency services against innocent Americans had ultimately strengthened the very laws and protections she had sought to undermine. As Maria looked around at the diverse crowd of Americans, celebrating not just survival, but triumph, she thought about the long arc of justice that seemed to bend inevitably toward truth. It was a difficult lesson, learned at tremendous cost, but it was a lesson that would echo through generations of Americans who would grow up in a more accessible more inclusive society because of what had happened on this spot 1 year before. The march that had begun in hope, been interrupted by hatred, and continued through determination, had finally reached its destination. Not the Capitol building, which had been their original goal, but something far more significant, a fundamental shift in how America viewed and valued the rights of all its citizens. In the end, Karen Whitmore's moment of rage had become a nation's moment of reckoning, and from that reckoning had emerged a stronger, more just society that would never again mistake the pursuit of equality for a threat to democracy. The disability rights movement had learned that October day that their rights, like all rights, required constant vigilance to protect. But they had also learned that when Americans stood together against injustice, no amount of lies or hatred could ultimately prevail against the truth. As the sun set over Washington, D.C., casting long shadows across Constitution Avenue, Maria Gonzalez wheeled slowly home, carrying with her the satisfaction of a battle fought, a victory won, and a democracy made stronger through the courage of those who refused to be silenced by fear.